if I can't be Einstein and solve every problem, then I must be stupid. If I can't work 24 hours a day without sleep, then I must be weak. If I can't do everything perfectly, then there's something wrong with me. So I can't accept that I'm a human. I have limitations. I can't do everything perfectly. I don't wear a cape. I'm not Superman. I am a human. Complex trauma makes people believe that being human is a weakness. I have to be Superman to survive. When I started in this field over 20 years ago, the lady that trained me said, Tim, if you don't learn healthy boundaries and healthy self-care, you're not going to last a year in this field because you are being exposed every day to other people's trauma, and it has a tremendous effect on your nervous system. And if you don't learn how to deal with that and take care of yourself, you're going to burn out. And I've watched many, many people do that. And it's very tragic. Secondary traumatic stress is the emotional duress that results when an individual hears about or watches the firsthand trauma experiences of another. It is described as the stress resulting from helping or wanting to help a traumatized or suffering person. But it's not just therapists. It's people working in high trauma environments. So think of policemen, firefighters, all your emergency services. You're being exposed every day to suffering, to death, to crisis situations, and that can lead to trauma. Then there's a third area where you can come across secondary trauma, and that is those that advocate for trauma survivors. So advocates or activists working in human rights, human trafficking, so anti-trafficking, abuse prevention. You're hearing the stories of hundreds and thousands of people who've been traumatized. And so you're learning about their suffering, you're absorbing their trauma. That is part of what it means to be an advocate. Then there's providing long-term support. So this could be caregivers of trauma survivors. So you're giving this necessary emotional support without your normal boundaries because you love these people, you care for these people. And so you just give, and it takes its toll. Some parents get this in a child that is trying to get sober or clean from drugs and alcohol, but they keep relapsing, and the parent just keeps trying to support them and help them, and they live through the chaos of the relapse and all that the child goes through. It gradually takes its toll. Another one is reading or watching traumatic content. So being exposed to graphic news stories, documentaries, social media, case files involving abuse, war, violence, disasters. So this could be a journalist. That's his area of work, and he's just researching and exposed to that all the time. That could be a content moderator, an editor, or that could just be you as a citizen watching documentaries, watching the news, watching social media, and just being exposed to horror story after horror story of what is happening in our world, all of the violation of human rights, and it just takes its toll. And I would say that technology, the internet, has just made us more vulnerable to secondary trauma. Years ago, when they didn't have TV or the internet, you were in your little village and you didn't know what was going on in the rest of the world, except once in a while you might have heard it through somebody passing through your village. And so you didn't get the exposure to everybody else's trauma. But now, every day, you can get exposure to millions of pieces of trauma from all over the world through the internet. I think another area is witnessing traumatized individuals. So if you have a friend or a son or a loved one that has come back from war, and they've got severe PTSD, and they're living with you, and then they're doing okay, and then one day they get triggered, and they act out, they have a breakdown, they get super depressed, they go to a very dark place, they harm themselves, and you are exposed to that over and over. So you see their flashbacks, how they dissociate, their panic attacks. That can just be very, very hard on you. Now, you might not be even sure if maybe you have secondary trauma. So let me give you a test that was developed in 2004 by Breed. So it's think about your work over the past 7 days. So read each statement and indicate how often you have experienced the following. So if never, put a 1, rarely 2, occasionally 3, often 4, very often 5. So the first 3 questions have to do with about re-experiencing symptoms or intrusion. I had disturbing dreams about the trauma experienced by others. Secondly, I felt emotionally numb in response to others' trauma. And I had trouble sleeping due to thinking about others' traumatic experiences. Second one is about avoidance or emotional distancing. So first, I avoided certain people or situations because they reminded me of others' trauma. 2, I felt emotionally detached from others, including those I serve. And third, I found it difficult to discuss traumatic events I was indirectly exposed to. And the third one is arousal or a heightened stress response. So first, I was easily irritated or had outbursts of anger. So that could have been later in the day or the next day. I had difficulty concentrating, or I felt jumpy or easily startled by unexpected noises or movements. So if you had 9 or 17, low risk of secondary trauma. 18 to 26, mild symptoms. 27 to 35, moderate. And 36 to 45, high risk of secondary traumatic stress. Seek support. So let me just go in a bit more detail on the symptoms of secondary traumatic stress. So as you can see, a lot of them follow symptoms of PTSD. But to me, there's subtleties here because there's a complex trauma environment. You're exposed every day to this. This is a gradual stuff that's taking its toll on you. And so you begin subtle ways of fight, flight, or freeze. And it's important to understand that complex trauma component. So some of the physical signs that you can look for is, and these could have other explanations as well, but there definitely could be because of secondary traumatic stress. You're constantly exhausted or fatigued. Then you start to have physical ailments that you don't normally have. So headaches, tense muscles, stomach issues, so irritable bowel stuff, gastrointestinal stuff. And then sometimes shortness of breath, heart palpitations that you don't normally have. Then there's some emotional indicators that you can be aware of. So you begin to feel detached from others or just kind of numb emotionally. You just don't have your normal emotional rhythm or range of emotions. You feel more anxiety, a sense of dread sometimes, just a persistent sense of unease. You find yourself more irritable, and that could have just anger outbursts that aren't normal for you, or mood swings that aren't normal for you. You feel a sense of guilt that you don't do enough to help, or a helplessness to help all these people. Or you over-identify with the trauma survivor's experience. So you get drawn in, you feel all of their emotions. You feel all of their pain. You can't let it go. You can't detach from it. It just weighs on you constantly. You have an increase in arousal and avoidance reactions related to the indirect trauma exposure. So you're just more hypervigilant. You're more jumpy. You just start avoiding certain things that might trigger you. Then there's a deeper cynicism, negativity that begins to develop, a deeper sense of hopelessness around the world or the people of the world, that the world's going to hell in a handbasket, everything is negative. You begin even to go to an existential crisis where you doubt your core beliefs. Why am I here? What's the purpose of life? All of those things begin to haunt you. You begin to lose an imagination for the future. Oh, I can't wait until 5 years from now. I got these dreams and plans. That begins to disappear. You have a reduced frequency of just happy moments. They might come very rarely or not at all. And then greater and greater dissatisfaction with your job, with your life. So those are emotional signs. Then cognitive signs are intrusive thoughts that begin to pop into your head uninvited about the other person's trauma, flashbacks, distressing mental images that pop into your head about their trauma or about some trauma that you have from your past. Then you get nightmares about their trauma or trauma from your past. Then difficulty concentrating or forgetfulness. So changes in your memory, changes in your ability to think, a brain fog can settle in. You find it hard to embrace complexity. Your brain just can't get itself around complexity. You find yourself trying to minimize problems, minimize situations in your life. Then there can be behavioral signs. You find you begin withdrawing from relationships, withdrawing from social settings. So you just prefer to isolate more. You don't want to be around people or in a social environment. You avoid certain places, certain people because they remind you of the trauma. Some people then begin to slide into increased substance use. So they find themselves drinking more alcohol, coffee, smoking more, even taking drugs. Others find that they begin losing their motivation. And so that begins to show up in reduced job performance. Or they just start procrastinating more around the house. Things aren't getting done. They avoid responsibilities. Others, they go into overworking. They can't turn off all of the adrenaline and cortisol. And now they can't stop themselves. They just go, go, go. Their mind is obsessing. They're working for 20 hours a day. They're just driven. Others go to just spending time in mindless distractions. They're procrastinating on all the important things, and they're busy just doing mindless, unimportant things. Some begin to feel alterations in their sense of self-efficacy. They just don't feel as confident as they normally would. They start to doubt themselves. They feel not good enough. There's a bit of a crisis happening there. Others, they start to have disruptions of their perception of safety, trust, independence. So because of all the trauma they're experiencing and that others are going through, they start to feel not so safe in their own life, that maybe they can't trust anybody. So again, another crisis is happening, and that can lead to hypervigilance. Then some relationship signs that people have. Some go through just loss of empathy, or they just don't want to connect to people. It just takes too much effort. They don't even want people in the same room because then that person might want to connect with them, and they don't want to connect with anybody. So they're really feeling that, and this is fascinating to me, what they need at that time is to connect. But what their complex trauma brain is saying is, let's go in the opposite direction. Connection takes energy. We don't have any energy. We need to go to zero connection so we can rest. And that doesn't really work, but that's what they do. Other thing is they develop resentment. So they just start seeing negative. They read negative into what their clients share, what their friends share. They question their motives. They see negative motives in everything their friends do. If somebody doesn't treat them perfectly, they get mad at them and develop a resentment towards them. So their bar goes up for everybody else. They see everybody else now through a judgmental lens, looking for fault, finding fault, developing resentment. Some really struggle with boundaries. So their bubble gets really big where they don't want to connect with anybody. They don't want anybody around. Others, they want to connect with everybody. They think that they just need somebody to take care of them. They return to almost an infantile state where I just need mommy and daddy to hug me, to meet all my needs, to take care of me. And so they tend to have very shifting boundaries when this is happening, and the boundaries become quite blurred. They go to avoidant behaviors of people. They just don't want to talk to anybody. They have this inability now to listen or be present. So they can be in the same room with somebody. They can have somebody talking to them, but they're not fully present to them. They're not able to be emotionally available to others. What this leads to, in my mind, is a very, very important question. So if you look at all the police officers in the world, firefighters, emergency response people, what you find is that some of them go through their jobs and they don't get secondary trauma. Whereas others go through their jobs, exactly same jobs, exactly same calls, experiences, and they get secondary trauma. And so you go, why do some go through the identical experiences and not get secondary trauma, whereas others get secondary trauma? And so what that points to is there's other contributing factors that make people vulnerable to secondary trauma pre those events. So things happened earlier in their life that set them up to be more vulnerable to secondary trauma than other people are. So a couple things to me that are significant. If a person goes into emergency response type jobs and they have their own complex trauma that they've never dealt with, those people have a high risk of ending up with secondary trauma. The events that create the secondary trauma, to me, they might go then for PTSD treatment and all of that and think the problem that I'm getting help for is my job and all the trauma I experience on the job. What I want them to realize is, yes, we got to look at that. We got to understand that and deal with that and help you with that. But we got to look at earlier in life to what set you up to be vulnerable to all of this stuff. And we got to go to an earlier time and see the complex trauma. So what happens with complex trauma is the child has all kinds of dynamics that come from being abused or neglected that cause them to feel shame. I'm not good enough. It's a core belief. Therefore, I need to people please. So they start these maladaptations to not get hurt. I got to do everything perfectly. I got to get over involved in people's lives. I can't set boundaries. The only way I can feel good about myself is others like me. So I got to be a hero. I can't talk about weakness. I can't open up and be vulnerable because then people will judge me and reject me. I can't show weak emotions because that would be perceived as weakness and I'll get hurt again. So I got to be strong. I got to shut down emotions. I can't do all of these different things that come out of complex trauma. So what you can see is when that person gets into an emergency response job, they are prime to have all the wrong tools to respond to the trauma in that circumstance. And they are not going to talk about it. Their shame is going to be, I got to be a hero. I can't be vulnerable, etc., etc. So complex trauma gives you a toolkit that let you survive as a child, but it doesn't work when you're an adult in that kind of job and you end up with secondary trauma. There's a couple other pieces here that are important. For many people with complex trauma, their life was a lot of chaos. Their life was a lot of cortisol and adrenaline. And what can happen for people is that when they get to adult life and they don't have the constant danger and chaos and adrenaline pumping, it feels kind of dull and boring. Doesn't match what their normal was. And so they're drawn to jobs that have chaos, that give them an adrenaline rush, and that can set them up for secondary trauma. Another thing that comes out of complex trauma is many people aren't good at accepting that they have human limitations. That is perceived as weakness. So if I can't be Einstein and solve every problem, then I must be stupid. If I can't work 24 hours a day without sleep, then I must be weak. If I can't do everything perfectly, then there's something wrong with me. So I can't accept that I'm a human. I have limitations. I can't do everything perfectly. I don't wear a cape. I'm not Superman. I am a human. Complex trauma makes people believe that being human is a weakness. I have to be Superman to survive. So now in adult life, they still think I got to be Superman to be a good human. And that sets them up to not accept they need self-care. They need rest. They need to talk about problems. They need to cry. They need to be open and vulnerable with safe people. That to them gets perceived as weakness. So they have to begin to learn to accept their human limitations. There's another issue that comes out of complex trauma, and that is much of complex trauma was unjust. So there was unfair treatment, there was abuse, there was neglect, injustice after injustice after injustice. There was racism, all kinds of different things. And so what happens for many people coming out of that is they now have a hyper drive for justice. They want justice. They're going to fight for justice. They're going to take on causes to bring about justice. That can go from a very healthy thing to an unhealthy thing. And now they basically take on every cause and burn themselves out. And that's not good. Another thing that comes out of complex trauma is that they tend to be very hard on themselves. That, oh, I need to fix this. Oh, you failed here. Oh, you're a loser here. They're constantly judging themselves. They have this strong internal critic that evaluates everything they do and somehow finds fault with it. And so they're always pushing themselves to be a better person, to do more, to try more. And that can set people up to move into the emergency response fields, to try to save the world, to be this perfect, wonderful person, to be hard on themselves all the time, and they end up in big trouble. And then complex trauma always has an element of false guilt. A child feels that I'm rejected and abused because it's my fault. I must be bad. I did something wrong. Dad's angry. It must be my fault. So you're trained to pick up stuff as your fault when it's not really your fault. False guilt that you should do more, that you're not doing enough, that you're being lazy, that you're being irresponsible, that you're being selfish if you're not giving more or helping more. And so that can set people up to be in trouble when they get into the emergency response fields. And then complex trauma is all about codependency. The child puts their needs down, makes the needs of the parents or others more important than their own, and they meet the needs of the other people, hoping that that will result in them being loved, that somebody will eventually meet their needs. And so their relationships are always, you give in order to earn love. You help people so that they will help you. Codependency. You're trying to get your needs met through giving up your needs to meet others' needs. And that sets up many to get drawn into the emergency services, the social services, where they then burn themselves out. Beyond complex trauma, there's also systemic cultural things that are important to understand that can lead people to secondary trauma vulnerability. So if you grew up in a culture where the work ethic was constantly stressed, where you got to be working, and if you relax, you're being lazy, you're being selfish, you are trained to drive yourself, to push yourself, to give. If you were raised in an environment where you were taught that love equals constantly sacrificing, constantly giving, but doesn't mean taking care of yourself, but that was actually being selfish, you're vulnerable to secondary trauma. If you grew up in an environment where there were magical fixes for fatigue, so let's say you gave yourself sacrifice yourself, work for 16, 20 hours a day, helping other people. Instead of saying you need to have good self-care for a couple of days, they just said God's going to take care of you. God's grace is enough. That sets up people to think that they're not human, that they have some magical fix that going to let them abuse their bodies, not meet their own needs properly, and get away with it. Then some people just grew up in environments where the mindset of the culture is we're all about helping those who aren't as privileged as us. And if you weren't helping people who aren't as privileged as you, you were made to feel guilty. And so, again, there's this sense of responsibility and guilt placed on you that you just absorbed as you grew up. Some grew up in cultures where you just don't talk about painful stuff. If you were to talk about your painful past, your sexual abuse, everybody would look at you and the room would get immediately quiet, and we don't talk about that. You'd be judged. That was out of bounds. Others, if you were to seek out help, you would be looked down upon as somebody who's weak, as somebody who's almost betraying the whole community and making the whole community look weak and not good enough by you reaching for help outside of the community. And so there's a tremendous subtle pressure to never reach out for help, to never talk about it. And then with that comes almost this cliche-ridden speech that tries to normalize everything and say, this is why you don't need help. Oh yeah, everybody got the strap back then. Everybody got beaten to a pulp if they did something wrong. That's just the way it was. Why make a big deal out of it? Just get over it. That's just the way it was. Nobody wants to talk about how it affected them. Everybody just wants to say that was the normal and try to minimize it. Or everybody's family was that way. Everybody got sexually abused. Why do we need to talk about this? We didn't have it worse than anybody else. It was the way everybody's family was. And so that whole thing creates a culture that prevents people from getting help. So there's two directions we need to go from here. So number one is if you are realizing that you have secondary trauma and it's bad, and you've got a work culture or a family culture or a community culture that makes reaching out for help, talking about it almost impossible, what do? Well, you got to break the rules of that culture. Get help. Our LIFT program helps people with secondary trauma. You finally have a place where you can talk about it, understand it, begin to learn tools to deal with it, begin to learn tools to get healthy so it doesn't happen again. Get help. You can't heal from this all by yourself within a culture that is judging you for trying to heal. You've got to reach out beyond that. But secondly, if you realize that you're in a work situation, a home situation that is exposing you to the trauma of others, and that secondary trauma is a possibility, what are steps to prevent that it happens to you? So here's a quote that basically says, we have an obligation to our clients as well as to ourselves, our colleagues, and our loved ones not to be damaged by the work we do. That is so important. So what do we do to not be damaged by the work we do? You got to learn good boundaries, self-care, meeting your 12 needs consistently. You want to enjoy a life that is sustainable. That means you got to balance work, play. You got to be able to turn off the things that you have to turn on at work. You got to take time every day, every week to have fun, to relax, to meet all of your 12 needs. Absolutely essential. To me, this is one of the most important things. So that might mean getting therapy on an ongoing basis for yourself so that you're debriefing and talking with a professional who understands this, who can help you see things you might not be seeing. You got to have good sleep, good exercise, good food, times of connection with loved ones, times of fun. times with friends, times with nature, times with solitude, somatic exercises that feed your soul. So pets, music, art, nature. You got to have mindfulness where you keep in touch with your own emotional world. You're present to yourself. So you're journaling, you're talking to somebody. So important to learn this. And this all means boundaries. You have to be able to say no to certain people. You have to be able to not allow people to encroach on your territory or force themselves into your life when you know it's not wise to do that. If you don't become a pro at boundaries, you will not prevent secondary trauma. It is absolutely essential to learn that. Then find things that fill your gas tanks, your emotional gas tank, your spiritual gas tank. Feed your soul, things that just fill you up. Do those things on a regular basis. So we're all in danger of secondary trauma, especially in the world that we live in. It's on us to prevent it. We can't expect some magic fix. We can't expect somebody else to do it for us. We have to learn the tools to do it. And I really encourage you to do it.